let's go ahead and get going. And so we're gonna have a great time today, and then this will go up on the website as well for everybody else. So good morning, and thank you for joining us virtually, just like old times. If you don't know me, I'm Hannah Chaney. I am the membership and admin specialist here at BRAHM. I know you were probably expecting Willard, who of course is our fabulous programs and outreach director. But I am thrilled to be taking his place today for this conversation with our curator, who you all know and love, I'm sure, Gabriel Wilson-Rhodes, which is quite the mouthful, but we love it. We chose to host this topic in this format that could be easily recorded and accessed in the future because, if you don't know, BRAHM is partnering with Viking River Cruises this year. We are doing a member exclusive trip along the Danube from Passau to Budapest. And while this is a unique experience for our members, we wanted to draw on Gabe's intimate knowledge of Central European art and architecture for everyone, not just those who might embark on that adventure with us in person. So Gabe, welcome.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yes, this is sort of a little secret about you that I did not know until fairly recently. So let's lay some groundwork. Can you tell us about your studies in Hungary and what spoke to you about this area of Central Europe?
Absolutely. So, in my role at BRAHM, I think everyone sees and understands me as, a curator and a scholar of American art, sort of from the late 19th century to the present. I have some specialties that y'all see on view pretty often, American Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, and also contemporary craft and design. Those are my passion at work these days, but once upon a time, I was an emerging art historian. And as many of us do, I chose an incredibly niche topic that ultimately my career sort of pulled me away from. But I think just for context, if we really want to go back to the beginning, why in the world I became an expert in Central European art history. Throughout most of my childhood, I was a very serious pre-professional ballet dancer to the point where I went away to boarding school for it. And not surprisingly, most of my teachers throughout my youth, all the way up until I went away to college, were Slavic in some way, shape, or form. Many of them were Russian or Ukrainian or from, former USSR countries. As we all know, ballet is an incredibly essential art form to culture in that part of the world. And so when I decided I didn't want to pursue ballet as a career, I arrived at college pretty confident that I wanted to study art history. And with this, a predisposition already towards Eastern European culture. And I quickly, as I solidified myself as a major, I began pursuing that as a focus, and discovered that as much as I love Russian art history, sort of fell down this rabbit hole about the other part of so-called Eastern Europe, and that's Central Europe, and began studying the art, architecture, and culture of the Habsburg Empire, which eventually took me to Hungary, which is ultimately what I spent the vast majority of my undergraduate and graduate career studying. I ultimately lived in Budapest for a good portion of my senior year, studying both the city and its art history and sort of making pilgrimages to the many places, spaces, and galleries that were displaying the artists and architects I was studying, and walked away with an incredibly sort of, at that point, robust knowledge of the region and its cultural production. Now, I do have to give some caveat. It's been about 10 years since this was my primary focus, but it's been incredibly thrilling to revisit my research, both from graduate school and undergrad, and sort of refamiliarize myself as I prepare to, return to this part of the world that I lived in when I was 21. and haven't had the opportunity to return to since. But it's something that in many ways is ingrained in my brain, and I imagine will be for the rest of my life.
That's fabulous. And that is such a formative period of your life to be spending in such an incredible place. In our description for this talk, you use the term, I'm probably going to butcher this, Mitteleuropa?
Very good. Mitteleuropa. And on that note, I think I'm going to go ahead and start sharing some images, because if we're going to start talking about Mitteleuropa, we should probably see what it looks like. Can everyone see that?
Just roll the shooter over. That
looks good for me.
For Switzerland to use.
Hold on. Let me try that one more time. Okay, there we go.
Beautiful.
And page. Okay. Well, unfortunately, I can't quite get it to just be that image, so you're getting a sneak preview of the images to come. But for our purposes, I'm actually going to start with not just Mitteleuropa, but an image of the geographic feature that in many ways defines it and defines the trip that I'm going to be taking with many of our BRAHM friends in the fall. This is a map of much of Europe that traces the path of the Danube River. The Danube River is the longest river in Europe. It is a body of water that is incredibly close to my heart. I have spent a fair amount of time on its shores and also moving down it. I have to say, I have never traveled the extent that we will be traveling this October. But for some context, it does exist, outside of the confines of just, what we call Central Europe. The Danube has its springs beginning in the Black Forest, south of Stuttgart in Germany, and then it travels pretty directly east for quite a ways from Germany to Vienna, and then passes briefly into Slovakia, passing through Bratislava, its capital, before taking a really sharp turn southwards and heading into Budapest and really cutting the current nation of Hungary in half before touching Croatia, passing through Serbia, and then finally making a pass along the Bulgarian and Romanian border to the Black Gates into the Black Sea. I can't really talk about this river and this part of the world without quoting the cultural historian that is maybe most formative to my work, who has written, what I could argue is the most definitive book about this river and its sort of implications for the region we're going to be discussing today. So Claudio Magri, a cultural historian in the 1980s, wrote a beautiful book called Danube, A Sentimental Journey from the Source to the Black Sea. And I'm paraphrasing him here, but he said, "The Danube is not a river, but a world. It flows through Europe not as a border, but a continuity. Though like a river, it is a journey and a return. It is history in motion." In many ways, not just trade, but really the artery, the spine of this region, of Mitteleuropa, is this river, is this feature of the landscape. It passes through what we understand to be the heart of Western Europe. It passes through the Austrian Alps, and then passes into the Pannonian Basin, which defines Hungary, all the way out to sort of, the marches of Eastern Europe in the Black Sea. And in many ways, Mitteleuropa is, not a easily definable category. It's also not a category that's entirely current. Many people understand Europe to be a division between East and West, Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And in many ways, Central Europe or Mitteleuropa gets subsumed into those categories. By and large, Central Europe is defined by sort of a German hierarchy. At the end of the day, the Habsburg dynasty ruled this part of the world for over half a millennium. And German was the lingua franca. It was the dominant culture. As we will discuss, it was incredibly important as an oppositional force as the nationalist movements of many of the countries we'll be visiting on this trip emerged in the 19th century. But, particularly after the 20th century, when we think of many of these nations, many of them were client states of the USSR, they were communist countries, and they became understood as Eastern European, when in fact, when we look across the long history of Europe, they had sort of a distinct political, cultural identity. So I guess for a little bit of context and to give you a map, this is what we mean. Let me shrink this just a smidge if I can to take away some of the pixelation. When we discuss Central Europe or Middle Europa, this is what we are talking about. This is a map of the Habsburg Empire, circa 1848. I chose a map from this period, in part for my own benefit, because this is really the point at which my research began. I was a scholar of Central Europe and particularly Hungary from 1848 through the First World War. I have used the term the Habsburg Empire a number of times. That is in some ways a misnomer for the work that I did as an art historian, because in 1848, something really important shifted in this region. There was a slew, a sort of broad uprising across the many ethnic nations that comprised the Habsburg Empire. Most importantly, the Hungarians, but you will see the Slovakians, the Poles, what are now the Czechs, the Transylvanians, which you could argue are the Hungarians or the Romanians, the Bosnians, the Serbs, the Croats, the Slovenes, they all rose up in this moment where national consciousness was first taking form. We have a very clear idea of what makes a nation and what national identity is in this day and age. But in many ways, that sort of awareness, that consciousness, that sort of intellectual cohesion didn't exist prior to the middle of the 19th century. Many of these nations were comprised of largely German-speaking aristocrats, or in the case of Hungary, prior to the 19th century, Latin-speaking aristocrats who were largely culturally and economically dependent on the capital in Vienna, and a broad swath of peasants who spoke vernacular languages. Hungarian was a vernacular language until there was a nationalist movement in the 19th century. There was not a shared Hungarian identity. There was not a shared Slovakian identity. The people who ruled those lands considered themselves German or Austrian, even if culturally or in their heritage, they could perhaps trace their roots back to the more localized vernacular cultures that existed there. But as the sort of yoke of the Austrian and Habsburg began to wear on them in the 19th century, that was the sort of impetus for the nationalist movements that emerged. All of a sudden, you had a middle class, you had an intelligentsia, a bourgeoisie, an intellectual class that began developing, for the first time, literature and poetry in the vernacular languages. In the case of, my primary focus, in the case of Hungary, for the first time you had sort of petty gentry, country gentry who had always spoken German or Latin, for the first time in sort of a resistance or rebellion against this larger imperial system that they were beginning to chafe under. And in response to that, they began writing in Hungarian for the first time, developing, in some cases, a written language associated with this vernacular peasant speech, and beginning to form sort of a history of their nation. Speaking of that, since my focus is Hungary, and we will be spending quite a bit of time in Hungary on this trip, I wanted to talk a little bit more about that kingdom as a case study. Many of the intricacies of this story are what drew me in to this region in the first place. The Hungarians exist in many ways in isolation in the larger milieu of European history. In fact, their name, in many ways, is a misnomer. Since their arrival in Europe in the 9th century, the Hungarians have named and called themselves the Magyars. But they were, in fact, a horse-riding, militaristic tribal people that rode in from sites unknown, but linguists and anthropologists have surmised that they were likely a band of Ural or Ugric peoples from Siberia and from northern Eurasian steppe. So the stands, Kazakhstan largely. And they rode in on horse in the 9th century, and the Europeans, already traumatized from other incursions from Eurasia, thought they were the Huns returned, and they called them the Huns. And so now, over 1,000 years later, we are still calling these people the Hungarians, when they in fact have no relation to the Huns. They have done a number of genetic studies, linguistic studies. There is no meaningful relationship there, but that sort of historical inaccuracy, that anachronism, is so deeply embedded that Attila, a la Attila the Hun, is still an incredibly common name for Hungarian boys, even though there is no relation there. But in many ways, they really, for the first centuries they were in Europe, in this region right here that makes up much of current Hungary, which is called the Pannonian or Carpathian Basin. Pannonia was the name of this area when it was a Latin colony. Its sort of larger geographic name is Pannonia. The Hungarians use both quite often. But they have lived there now for going on 1,300 years. And for those first centuries they were there, they settled, they monopolized that landscape, and they were in many ways considered invaders for the first centuries they lived there. They had tribal kings, and it was not really until the 12th century that they began to integrate themselves more actively into the larger European milieu. And that was largely begun with, let me shrink this down because it's quite a large painting, with the baptism of Vike, who would then become known as Saint Stephen or King Stephen of Hungary, and began the dynasty of the Kingdom of Hungary. With that conversion, Hungary became the march, sort of the outland of Christian Europe. And that, for the following centuries, would really define the identity of this region. As you look across the sort of south and southeastern edge of the Habsburg Empire, you can begin to understand how this was the vanguard protecting Christian Europe from the east. First from further sort of raiders from the Eurasian steppe, from Mongolia and elsewhere, and then later from the Ottoman Empire. And much of Hungary's identity as a European nation in those first centuries was defined in opposition to the incursions of sort of non-Christian armies and their role as the defenders on the front of Christian Europe. That would sort of continue all the way until the 16th century when, as often happened, lines of succession became deeply mixed after, many generations of intermarriage, and the Hungarian dynasty came to an end, and the Habsburg dynasty came to a head. The Habsburg dynasty began as sort of an Austrian duchy. We think of Germany as a nation now, but for the vast majority of its history, Germany was not a singular political body, but was in fact, a conglomerate of many, many principalities and duchies and sort of small royal holdings that sort of held a cultural bond with each other. But Austria was really the first to emerge independently, and the Austrian nation was the homeland of the Habsburg Empire. But as we will see, as we saw in this previous map, ultimately it held a number of nations within its thrall. And for many, many centuries, they were the predominant sort of cultural force across these disparate cities. We see Prague, we see Krakow, we see Budapest, we see Zagreb and Ljubljana. We even see a bit of Italy and the Tyrolean Alps, and in Trieste, which is, these days considered, just an extension of Venice, but at one time was the most important port for this empire, this inland-bound empire. But as we think of Hungary, this history is not in isolation. Hungary is sort of particular and unique in the history of this region, but its story is reflected in the stories of all the other ethnicities that would continue to fight for independence up until World War I. So the reason I also chose 1848 as the time period for the map I'm showing you is because that is the moment that fundamentally shifted the structure of this region. Previously, this part of the world had been the last holdout in regards to feudalism. By the mid-19th century, much of Western Europe had shifted or begun shifting towards more modern forms of government. Many of them, even if they were still monarchies, had begun to evolve their monarchies into more bureaucratic systems that privileged, if nothing else, an aristocracy with, nominal, loyalty towards the wider populace. In Hungary and Austria, a feudal system had persisted, and the peasantry, the vast majority of the populace, particularly in Hungary, was still functioning within a serf system, a serfdom system. So not slavery in the purest sense, but a level of sort of geographic and political disenfranchisement that did not privilege any citizen other than the aristocracy as a independent citizen. And it was not until the rebellions of 1848 that the Habsburg Empire was forced to reconsider itself as a political and bureaucratic structure. And the Habsburg Empire, which had until recently been the Holy Roman Empire, the last vestiges of it, became the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Hungary was elevated to be the first among seconds, the first among the imperial minorities. And the most important role in the land became not just the Habsburg Emperor, but the King of Hungary. Conveniently, that was still the same person. That was still the same Habsburg Emperor, but it did shift the sort of locus of power, or the loci of power in the region. And the two dual capitals of Vienna and Budapest became the real sort of gravitational pulls in the region, and much of the cultural and artistic production orbited around those two urban centers. And really my specialty, my interest lies in those last decades of the 19th century into the first decades of the 20th, and the moments that cultural production was at such a height. It was moving at such a profound speed. And in many ways, many historians argue in anticipation of the reckoning that would be the First World War, that in many ways gravitated around this part of the world. The war began with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the Habsburg heir. And so just to give you a sense of what some of the things we'll be looking at as we move down this river, particularly as we get to the major sites of Vienna and Budapest, I'm going to talk about some of the artists and architects that were essential to my research and really define much of the landscape and art history of this region. So we'll talk about first an architect that, if you're not familiar with, I'm excited to share with you, Otto Wagner. He is really in many ways not just an architect of important sites and buildings, but the architect of the Viennese secession. At the turn of the century, Art Nouveau was the prevailing stylistic, aesthetic of the continent. But in many ways, it owes its roots to this part of the world, which is not as widely known. This began as a movement called Jugendstil in the German-speaking world, which translates to the young style, the style of youth. But also the secessionist movement was particularly how it was termed in Vienna. And Otto Wagner was an architect, an urban planner, and a designer. I had a whole array of options I could have chosen to use to represent for his career and his work. But here I have specifically chosen the Church of St. Leopold in Vienna. In many ways, I think it is a beautiful example of the secessionist approach to architecture, this sort of return to incredibly square forms, a nod towards Central Europe's in-betweenness. You can really see some influences from Slavic and Russian architecture, particularly in the dome and the use of gold. But you also see this streamlining of material and the sort of broader silhouette of the form. Vienna at this point was defined by a whole array of sociocultural upheaval. There was this profound rise of the bourgeoisie that was happening across Europe in the latter half of the 19th century. It was particularly pointed in Vienna. Much of the cultural production began to shift outside of royal and aristocratic commissions and became incredibly focused on the bureaucratic and civic needs of the middle class. But what's different about this region is that the aristocracy and the imperial family understood this shift and fed into it to sort of maintain their cultural supremacy. So this is a royal commission, an imperial commission, this important church. But, despite being an incredibly conservative institution, the imperial family, they accepted sort of these radical changing aesthetic mores and the intellectual sort of precepts that they represented. I mean, it's not just art and architecture that the secessionist movement is reflected in. And another key figure in the secession is the sort of emergence of psychology, the emergence of modern and contemporary music, Wagnerian opera. This is a moment where, German cultural thought is really blooming in a way that has long-reaching impacts. But Otto Wagner's architecture became a way to articulate the urban space of Vienna as a site for these changes. And so alongside Otto Wagner, perhaps the best known member of the secessionist movement, we see someone like Gustav Klimt. Everyone knows The Kiss. It is perhaps one of the most iconic paintings of the early 20th century. And in many ways, this reflects that turn inwards that broad cultural thought took in that period. Many of the sort of emotive forces that you see in painting at the turn of the century in Vienna and in Austria is incredibly psychological, it's personal, it becomes much more intimate, almost erotic in many ways. And Klimt's images were incredibly controversial when they were first shown. But now we understand them to be sort of cornerstones of the visual turn at this period in history. Now, I'm going to use a metaphor that is often used by scholars who focus on this part of the world, but it may be new to you. The term is the garden and the workshop. And so that is a reference to the dual capitals. Vienna was the garden. It was the site of luxury, the site, one goes into the garden at night to spend time with oneself, to go into the mind. And the workshop was Budapest, the other half of the empire's dual capital system. And while Vienna was sort of a place for leisure and luxury, Budapest was the site for production and innovation. and sort of the working of the New World, both sort of physically and economically. It had an incredibly robust industrial system, but it was also the site for the labor of nation building. Much of the sort of emerging radical thought, not just for Hungary, but for all of the other client states of the empire, happened in that city. It was the site where young thinkers, young gentry came from, the reaches of Croatia and Krakow and Bohemia. They came to Budapest to sort of engage in the national movement. And so I'm going to shift to Budapest because it is my great love. And much of my research and academic work has been about the two sort of figures I'm about to discuss. The first being Ödön Lechner, who in many ways is the counterpart to Otto Wagner in Hungary and Budapest. He's called the Gaudi of the East, the Gaudi of Hungary. If you're familiar with Gaudi, if I pulled up an image, you would recognize him, an incredibly important Spanish architect in Barcelona and elsewhere. But Lechner is really credited with creating the stunning anachronism that is the Hungarian national style at the end of the 20th century. I say that because, as I've mentioned, the Hungarians are, as I mentioned already, the Hungarians are prone to anachronism, and I think a really beautiful way. They name their sons Attila. They still claim this fun history, despite it being entirely false and them knowing that. And this architecture reflects that and more. There are references to Mughal architecture, from the Muslim empires of India, where they also at that time period were anachronistically tying their legacy back to. There's also this beautiful use for the first time formally of majolica tile, which is a Hungarian cultural product. That glazing and tile production happens in the countryside of Hungary. And you see these buildings that don't necessarily draw on a real historical style, but pull together many historical references and motifs to build something that became uniquely Hungarian. So this is the Museum of Applied Arts. It is one of the buildings I hope I will be visiting when we are in Budapest. It is an incredibly unique piece of architecture that is part of what drew me to Lechner, is that there is no precedent, there is no sort of equitable comparison to him. And in many ways, the landmarks he built, both across the city and across the region, continue to sort of function as essential landmarks when you're tracing the built landscape of Hungary and the region. I also really love the St. Elizabeth Church, or the Blue Chapel, as it's called. This is actually in Bratislava. I think that also speaks to the porousness between what we now consider to be independent and sort of individuated nations. Bratislava was just another royal city at the time. It is now the capital of Slovakia, but at the time that, Slovaks and Slovakia was just an emerging concept, in the late 19th century. But this is sort of a more holistic representation of the fantasy that Lechner was able to create with his buildings. A site that I have not had the chance to visit yet, but is a truly stunning piece of architecture. Now, alongside sort of the national foment that was happening across the region, in Hungary, there was a real concerted effort, like Lechner did with his architecture and painting, to build a visual national style, something that could not just define the aesthetics of Hungary, but also become a tool in the project of nation building and nation defining. And so the vast majority of my research as a young academic was about a specific group of painters, and one of them in particular. And these are the painters that founded the artist colony named Nagybanya. Now, if you look Nagybanya up on a map, you might note currently it's not in Hungary. It is in Transylvania, which is now a part of Romania. If you join me on this trip, I encourage you not to talk about Transylvania while in Hungary, because it is still an incredibly sore point. There are still bumper stickers with the sort of outline of Hungary and the outline of Transylvania next to it, with various slogans about the sort of historic crime that happened after World War I at the Treaty of Trianon, where Transylvania and other parts of Hungary, because of their relationship to Austria and to the German powers, that broke the country apart and gave Transylvania to the emerging Romanian kingdom. But in many ways, at that time, Transylvania wasn't just considered a part of Hungary, it was considered the cultural heart of Hungarian peasant culture. And so in the last decades of the 19th century, a group of painters fled Budapest to the Transylvanian countryside and founded an artist colony in this small village named Nagybanya. And their thought was the only way to make truly Hungarian art was to integrate, as they said, Hungarian blood with Hungarian soil, and to paint these peasant rural landscapes that were essential to the sort of geological and geographic history of what made their kingdom what it is. What's funny is most of these painters were not trained in Hungary, almost none of them. Most of the artists who were a part of this group were trained in Munich, some even farther west in Paris. The artist that I am most invested in, not the one we're seeing here, but the one we'll see in a moment, was Viennese by birth, but considered himself Hungarian. So I think it's just sort of a reflection of the mutability of identity in this space and in this time period. I've chosen this painting first, though, for two reasons. One, because it's by a painter named Szymon Helozy, or Simon, if we want to pronounce it in English. Szymon was the founder of the Nagybanya artist colony, and in many ways, while he was the elder of the group, while he had trained many of the artists who were a part of his milieu, he was in many ways the most radical. This painting is not of a specific historical event. It is actually a visualization of an incredibly important nationalist song and composition called the Rákóczi March. In this painting, he has reimagined this important sort of national rallying cry as a children's march, and he has sort of situated it in the attempted revolution of 1848. And he is visualizing for him what is the uprising of the peasants and the landed gentry almost half a century before, and sort of is working to create this anachronistic but no less emotional image about the importance and the sort of emotive power of Hungarian independence and Hungarian sort of cultural independence. So as I mentioned, Szymon is not my primary focus. I spent a really, honestly, astounding amount of time looking at the painting we're about to see together. This is October by Károly Ferenczi, or Charles Ferenczi. As I mentioned, he was born in Vienna. He was trained in Munich, and then the Forest of Fontainebleau in France, before returning to the empire and then returning to Hungary, where he became deeply invested in the project of articulating Hungarian identity through painting. He took a different approach, and that is why I have written probably 150 pages about him in my life. I think at one point I was probably the preeminent expert on this colony and this artist in America. I love him so much. This painting is tattooed on my body. But Károly really took an ingenious approach to articulating Hungarian sovereignty in his paintings. And I think he is very much a painter of his time. He was an incredibly bourgeois, upper middle class man. He was a Viennese gentleman, and he was trying to superimpose that sort of social power into his paintings. And what he did that was so transformational and so radical was to integrate the body with the landscape. There are some paintings where this is more obvious. There's a particularly powerful deposition from the cross. That is the sort of biblical moment where Christ is removed from the cross after death. And in that painting, the body of Mary wailing and the body of Christ reflect the mountains behind them. And I have argued, sort of my academic work, that this flattening, this convergence of the body and the landscape is making a claim about the Hungarian body with the Hungarian landscape. I think this painting is particularly beautiful because it is situating a Hungarian gentleman, a bourgeois sort of intellectual within the Transylvanian countryside. We see how his sort of bourgeois accoutrement, his lovely picnic table with a tablecloth and fruit and tea and the umbrella, how they mirror each other. He becomes sort of the singular composition, but he is poised on the precipice of the Hungarian wilderness. He is poised on the precipice of this thing that is essential and viscerally Hungarian, or Magyar, as they would call it. And in many ways, through a number of paintings like this, Ferenczi created a body of work that is still revered in Hungary today. Just a little anecdote. I went to Hungary. I went there as an undergraduate student, specifically to study the city and study this artist. And I was heartbroken when I first arrived and visited the National Museum in Buda, the Buda side of the city, and discovered not a single painting by Ferenczi in the galleries. I was confused, but my Hungarian was only so good, and I was too embarrassed to ask the museum workers available why none of it was on view. And about 3 weeks before I left, before I had to move home back to the States, a giant banner unfurled across the side of the former royal palace where the museum was. And all it had was a cropped portion of this painting and Ferenczi in truly giant letters. And I realized nothing had been on view because they'd been preparing for the biggest exhibition of his work in decades. And so in the last weeks that I lived in Budapest, I was able to experience almost every painting by him, and including this one. To this day, this is the only work of art I've ever cried in front of, perhaps because I had spent already at that point 3 years studying it and writing about it. But just sort of one magical moment for me in that region. And so I could go on and on and on. I've already been talking for a while, and this is just a small portion. I think to give y'all a reference as we get closer to our adventure into Europe, I will be giving a much, much more formal traditional lecture. But this was just a moment to give everyone a tease and a bit of context for why in the world we're making this trip and why in the world I'm on it. So, Hannah, I hope that answered your question a little bit, at least.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think we're very lucky to have a curator who had such formative scholarly experiences in such an incredible place. And it seems like with such a unique, the idea of them being sort of anachronistically created into their own sort of nationality is so fascinating and very, very unique. And it's, of course, easy to see how passionate you are about all of that. I do have just like a couple of little wrap-up questions, because, it is surprising, right, that you have ended up where you have with your initial focus and love. But how do you feel like this foundation in sort of Central European art has served you working at an Americanist institution like BRAHM?
That is a very fair question. And part of it I can answer really directly. At the end of the day, I fell in love, before the architecture, I fell in love with these paintings because I loved Impressionist and Post-Impressionist painting. And I would argue that Curator Ferenczi is one of the most undersung Post-Impressionist masters of Europe. And so I came to BRAHM with this really, I think, robust understanding of the movements and forces that were shaping painting, particularly landscape painting, from about 1870 through 1920. And it just so happens that timeline lines up beautifully with much of the foundational collection that BRAHM opened with, much of it from the Alexander family. those are, examples of American Impressionist and Post-Impressionist painting, but so much of it translates over. I think also this was the genesis point of me being a medium generalist, to really study closely this time and place. I studied painting, I studied architecture, I also studied sort of craft design, and all the sort of ways that this nationalist thought and nationalist aesthetic trickled out to society. And that prepared me for ultimately the turn that my professional career took, which was becoming someone who was deeply interested and focused on craft and design. Ultimately, that would be a product of the time I spent at Cranbrook in Michigan, an important site for those currents in American visual history. But I was able to take a lot of the sort of expertise I developed while looking at Central Europe, and many of those same questions and frameworks are able to be transposed. And I think, maybe the least directly, but the most importantly, I spent so much of my academic career thinking about the margins and the liminal spaces and sort of the geographies in between that often get forgotten or under-discussed in the larger conversation. And in many ways, I think Appalachia functions similarly. And so much what I do here is thinking about the Mountain South, this space and place that has such robust historical creative production, but often doesn't get talked about as seriously or as centrally as other regions in America.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And I mean, we've done a good bit of talking today already about, blood and soil and this sort of like connection to place in the landscape. But specifically for 2026, we have this incredible focus on landscape this year. So like, how do you see this trip sort of pairing with the way that we look at our own American landscape, and particularly here in the mountains?
Goodness, it's impossible for me to extricate the two from each other. I am able to do the work I'm doing this year at BRAHM because of this foundation, because of this background, in my own art historical study. None of you will have gotten to see it yet, but all the signage is arriving as we speak. We are just wrapping up one of our most important installations of the year that sort of ties this whole thematically consistent year together, where we are focusing on American landscape to celebrate 250 years of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And much of what I talk about is landscape theory, which might mean nothing to most people, but to me is a conversation about the power of landscape, the fact that landscape is always political. It's always making some sort of claim about place, who controls it, who owns it, how we're supposed to perceive it, what sort of emotions and histories we're supposed to overlay on it. And all the sort of tools and skill sets and sort of historical forces that came to bear on this research and on this region, it's not dissimilar in America. There was so much shifting and changing in how we perceived the land that we lived on in the 19th century into the 20th century in America. And so many of those things are reflected in the paintings and the works of art that are opening to the public in just over a week in our exhibition Horizon Line, where we are literally tracing, landscape painting from about 1850 through the present moment. Yeah.
Wow. Could not be more perfect. So when our visitors get back, if they join us on this adventure, what do you think their eye might be more keenly attuned to after this focus?
Goodness, that is a hard question to answer, because even I, almost 15 years later, am overwhelmed when I consider how much I took in to my brain and into my memory while I lived there. But I think I would hope an understanding for the holisticness, the totality with which the visual culture of a specific place or geography comes together. That architecture speaks to art, art speaks to politics, politics, speaks to the cultural memory and legacy that these places create. They are all in conversation, and that at the end of the day, landscape and images of our landscape are inextricably bound up with that. I would also hope they take away this sort of, I hate to use the word unique, but this sort of unique place this region occupies within European cultural history. It is not just East and West. It's not just East, West, and Central, but that Mitteleuropa has this incredibly rich, multivalent history that is worth exploring. And then I forgot, I had one more image, which is this one. And so to be clear, tragically, we will not be, traversing the entire stretch of the Danube River. I wish, but that would probably take about 3 weeks. We will be, as you mentioned, traveling from Passau to Budapest. But, convenient for me, we will be sort of traipsing down, floating down the sort of middle stretch that is most essential to what I was talking about today and my own research. So I hope people walk away with a profound appreciation, both for the place and its built landscape, and also for the people, because they're incredibly wonderful and kind and lovely. And the food is delicious and the languages are beautiful. And, it was transformative for me. So I have no doubt it will be transformative for everyone else.
Wonderful. Well, gents, if you have any final questions, I'd love to open it up if you have a last wrap-up question for Gabe. Let's see if I can get you unmuted.
I'm unmute. Am I unmuted?
There you are.
Okay, good. Parallel to this excellent discussion of Central Europe that you've discussed is a book which is about primarily 1900 Vienna, written by a Nobel award-winning neuroscientist named Eric Kandel, and I'm not sure whether you're familiar with him or not.
That sounds very familiar.
He wrote it in 2013, and his parents were pioneers from Vienna to the United States, and he became a neuroscientist at Columbia. He became interested in how the brain interprets art and what parts of the brain and what neurocircuits are involved when someone enjoys art. Oh. And he discusses 1900 Vienna and primarily the Jewish population and its interaction with the medical society in Vienna at the time, Freud and so forth. And he goes through the different circuits of the brain and how they respond. His book, you may be familiar with, is The Age of Insight, The Quest to Understand the Unconscious in Art, Mind, and Brain from Vienna 1900 to the Present.
No, I have not read that, but it is officially on my list.
Well, I'm a retired neurologist, so it's definitely on my list. But
I don't know how much I'll be able to understand, but it
you
would
will.
have certainly been on my bibliography. Good.
He writes very, very well, and I think you'll enjoy it. He discusses primarily Schiele and Kokoschka and Klimt, as well as the music and the Freudian interest in psychology at that time. But it goes along a lot with what you were saying.
And if anyone is interested in the bibliography, the references I can give y'all, if you are interested in reading more about this period, it is, extensive. Though I'm so happy to have a new text to add to that, because I am revisiting many of sort of the seminal books that, form the foundation of this knowledge I have in preparation for this trip. So I don't sound like a fool when I'm riding down the river with people. I've got to remind myself it's been a while.
Amazing.
Any other questions or comments?
I can't.
What was the book you referenced earlier?
Oh, at the very, very beginning.
Yeah.
So that is it's titled Danube: A Sentimental Journey from the Source to the Black Sea by Claudio Magri. It is, I would argue, one of the most important pieces of cultural history writing from the 20th century. It is incredibly dense and poetic all at the same time. He is referencing just this astonishingly broad swath of history, but it is sort of a masterclass in, I would argue, a field that's dying, traditional cultural history, where you sort of, every bit of source material is the purview of the historian. But it is really stunning and is worth visiting. It will probably take you from now till October to read because it's so dense. But worth the slog.
Amazing.
Oh.
Well, thank you, Gabe, for adding books to our reading lists and for your time and expertise. Thank you guys for joining us. If you do feel inspired to consider joining that trip this autumn, do check out the Danube Waltz member trip. It is on our website. And of course, we will be linking this recording to that page later this week so that you can revisit it or share it with friends. If you are in town this coming week, do please join us. I know Gabe mentioned we have our winter exhibition celebration this coming Saturday, so the 28th of February. All of our galleries will be full. It's going to be exquisite. I cannot wait to see it. And that will be at 5 p.m. on Saturday. But until then, I hope you're all well and staying warm, and we're almost through the winter.
Amen.
All right. I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
It was great.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.